exiting the criminal justice system, and about 500 of them people who were keeping out of prison in the first place, people who are facing 2 or more years in jail or prison, and we pull into our programs with agreements from the judges and the prosecutor and the defense attorney so that they can be in the community for 6 to 12 months working on programming. And then the programs that we've created have been all around the needs of people who've been involved in the criminal justice system, and I'll just rattle off a few of them. We're a licensed mental health treatment provider. Our prisons are surrogates for mental health institutions, unfortunately. We're a licensed drug and alcohol treatment provider. We run an employment services program where we place about 375 people into jobs each year. We have an education unit, basic education up to GED, and then a program that helps people to get into college and navigate the college process while they're dealing with all the reentry related issues. Family services, counseling, probably more importantly, housing, right? This is the voice of Harlem, and we actually are your neighbors here in Harlem. On 140th and Riverside, we run reentry housing through a building we call the Castle, a beautiful Gothic structure on 140th and Riverside that we purchased over 10 years ago. And then next door to it, what we call Castle Gardens, which is a new building that we built from scratch, 114 units of affordable and supportive housing, where when we went to build this building, we went to the community and said we want to build more housing for people with criminal records. And anyone who knows the history of Fortune in Harlem, it started out with the community being our biggest opposition, even though this is one of the communities most affected by criminal justice issues. And then 6 years later, when we went back and said we want to build more housing for people with criminal records, I'm happy to say that the community said, not only can you build more housing because you've been such a great neighbor and that building's been so safe, but we want to live there too. And we ended up with affordable and supportive housing, a mixed-use building, green building, LEED Gold certification with 20,000 square feet of service space in the building.
Wow. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
That's really good, because I would think initially you would have had some kind of resistance to that.
Yeah, well, initially.
But now that it seems like the community's embraced you up there.
Well, initially, we were talking about 11 years ago when the city of New York all but dumped the sewage treatment plant on this community because it was the only community that couldn't fight back against it. And so we were on the heels of that, telling the community that right across the street, we were also going to build housing for people with criminal records. And the community was like, no, you're not.
Right.
But, we've come so far that the Attorney General, Eric Holder, just about a year ago, helped us to launch a toolkit called In Our Backyard around the NIMBY issue, the Not in My Backyard issue, because we were so successful at getting the community on board. In fact, Community Board number 9 meets in our building.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay. So tell us how you got involved with it and why this issue is so important to you.
Sure. That's a good question. So I did 6 years in prison here in New York State. I grew up in Brooklyn, found myself in trouble, ended up doing 6 years in prison as a result of, really bad decisions. And while I was in prison, people often ask me if I'm motivated by the fact that I did time. I was mostly motivated by all of the young men that I met in the correctional system, mostly Black and Latino, who were doing a lot more time than I was for a lot less serious crimes, to be frank. There were guys I met there who had gotten locked up when they were 16 for drug crimes, possession of drugs, had already done 15 years, and here I come in, do 6, and leave, and they still have another 5 or 6 to do. These guys are doing 25 years for possession of drugs. And all that comes out of our war on drugs and our tough on crime policies of the 80s and 90s. And, I was lucky enough to be able to earn a 2-year liberal arts degree while I was in prison, which for me was transformative. And the question for me was just, can I walk away from this like most people with criminal records do because of the stigma? And my decision was that I was so motivated by helping out, what I saw were guys where their talent was being wasted away in prison. That I started doing advocacy work at a place called the Legal Action Center, which is where I got my start. And I worked for a public interest law firm for 6 years, learned a lot from the attorneys there, started doing a lot of policy advocacy work, writing, drafting bills, changing laws here in New York State and policies, and then ultimately nationally. And then left the Legal Action Center and went to Fortune, mostly because I wanted to be in a space where I was constantly surrounded by people who were coming home from prison. That was really important to me. It's one thing to have my own experience, but I was already 6-7 years away from that experience. And Fortune is an organization that started as an advocacy organization, but still puts advocacy work. The advocacy work really trumps the service, the direct services. We really would prefer to break down the systemic issues that impact our clients while at the same time helping individual clients who walk through the door.
Mm-hmm. You're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, and this is Legalese with Tony Johnson. And today's guest is Glenn Martin, who is the Vice President of Development and Public Affairs and the Director of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. So I would love for everyone listening and watching us on the web to call in at 212-650-6903. That's 212-650-6903. And if you have any questions regarding re-entry, whether it's for a family member or a friend, or maybe you were formerly incarcerated yourself and you're interested in some of the services that Glenn just talked about in regard to housing or employment or other types of legal issues that we can address for you. Again, as I always tell people, that I can't really give them specific legal advice, but if you'd like more information, you can certainly contact us after the show. But I would really encourage everyone listening to call in at 212-650-6903 and to ask your questions and get some of the answers that you need to bring back to your friends and family members and loved ones. So, Glenn, tell us a bit about the kind of advocacy work that you're doing and that Fortune is doing.
Sure. So, based on my own experience trying to navigate the labor market after I was released, when I got to Fortune, I was thinking, what can we do to educate more employers about the fact that we actually have an anti-discrimination law here in New York State for job seekers with criminal records. Most people don't know that. Most employers don't know that. It's called Article 23A of New York State Correction Law. And what it really says is that while employers can take into account liability concerns, legitimate liability concerns, that they have to look at a host of other factors, including age at the time of the conviction, severity of the conviction, time elapsed since the conviction, evidence rehabilitation, whether a person has what's called a certificate of relief from disability, and New York State's public policy of encouraging the employment of people with criminal records. So what I recognize is that based on my experience of visiting 35 to 40 different employers within a few months after coming home, is that most employers were still blanket discriminating and didn't even realize that this law existed. Not many employers will look across the table and say, you know, I really like you, but you're in that wheelchair, right? Because they understand the Americans with Disability Act, you know, there were repercussions. Yet with this law, that's just as clear, employers will still say you have a felony. We don't hire anyone with felonies. And that's against the law here in New York State. Most people don't recognize that. So I drafted a bill along with my colleagues called the Employer Education Act, which passed and was signed by Governor Patterson when he was in office. And it requires employers to post the anti-discrimination law conspicuously in the workplace, and to give a copy of it to the subject of a background check whenever they do a criminal record background check. And for me, that was a way to get employees to come into contact with the law, but also to get the subject of the background check, right, people like myself, to understand that we have some level of protection. And I get that when people come home from prison, you know, they say, well, I need a job, I don't want a discrimination lawsuit. But the truth is that if the person who applied for that job before them would have filed a claim, there's a good chance that that employer wouldn't have discriminated against them. So I really try to encourage people to not just get on their feet, but at the same time recognize that there are laws to protect them, especially in the employment arena. A little bit less so in housing and education, but Fortune is working on some of these issues. So for instance, in 1994, Congress took away access to Pell Grants for people in prison. And it was a tough on crime bill. It was not an education bill. It was all about being tough on crime. It was called the Violent Crime Control Act, signed by President Clinton.
So let me ask you, is that still in effect today? Because I hear certain things about if you're an ex-felon, you can't get financial aid.
Yeah, I'm going to clarify that. I'm glad you brought that up because it has what's called a chilling effect because people don't know what the law is. So here's the law. When you're incarcerated, while you're incarcerated, you do not have access to federal grants to go to college. So what that meant was the systemic loss of college in prison here in New York and across the country. But that's different than where people get confused. So once you're formally incarcerated, you're home. On the FAFSA application, it does ask whether you've been convicted of a drug crime, but it's no longer retroactive. So you would have to be on financial aid and be convicted of a drug crime while you're on financial aid to be barred. But even then, if you take a licensed drug and alcohol treatment program, you're no longer barred. And I say all that just to say that the majority of people who have already been convicted, who are already free, actually are not barred from getting financial aid.
Okay.
But you know what happens? People look at the application, they get really nervous, and they don't bother to go forward, and that's the chilling effect from having these policies.
And that's the same thing which that you just mentioned earlier about people who may have a discrimination claim. You know, I find that people who may have a claim, one, don't know how to go about pursuing it. They may not know a lawyer or think it's too expensive. And really the bottom line is that they just want to get a job. They don't want to fight.
Right.
You know, and they don't want to drag out something while they're still wondering how they're going to pay their bills.
Yeah.
You know, so some things get left undone and the discrimination continues.
But, you know, let me say something there, because I don't think it's only the responsibility of the individual. I think the city of New York and the state of New York can do a better job of telling people their rights, and having the State Division of Human Rights and the City Commission on Human Rights be much more proactive in reminding job seekers and employers that this law exists by doing much more enforcement. I did a focus group a few years ago with employers, asking them about their hiring practices, and I'll never forget when we all left the room and you could look through the one-way glass and you could hear the employers speaking to each other. One employer said to the other, I don't hire anyone with a felony. If they have a misdemeanor, I'll give them a shot, not a felony, right? Against the law in New York State.
Sure.
I'll never forget the other employer leaning over and said, not until the EEOC knocks at your door. And, you know, that's when you'll do the right thing. And so it just reminded me that we need to think about the carrot and the stick. How do you incentivize employers hiring people, but at the same time be comfortable pursuing employers who outright break the law? Because here it is in a nutshell. Criminal record-based discrimination is a surrogate for race-based discrimination, whether it's intentional or not.
It does happen. I mean, and you can look at the racial makeup of people who are incarcerated. So, of course, when you're coming out and you're looking for a job and you're not clear as to whether or not you have been discriminated against regarding employment, one of the ways that people, I had an employment lawyer on this summer, and she was talking about the same thing, about how it becomes an issue racially because there are so many Black and Latino men and women incarcerated in this state, and so when they come out, they're not really clear as to whether or not when they check off that box on the application, if it's a problem for them to move forward with some type of employment. And I know for a fact when I represent some clients and they call me and ask me, how should they address that question on an employment application? I mean, I tell them one thing, but I'd like to hear how you would counsel somebody in that regard.
Sure. I mean, maybe because I worked at a law firm for 6 years myself, I'd probably give a response that's probably equally as legalese as the one you would probably give, which is you cannot lie on an application because it's a legal document. So you need to tell the truth. I tell people to name the conviction. Some people like to try to put the penal code. I know if I was an employer and I only saw the penal code, I'd actually be pretty pissed off that you're trying to make me do the research. But I also tell people that when you have a chance to explain yourself, you need to go from here's what I was convicted of, here's what I did, to here's what I've done since then.
Right.
And so we do a lot at Fortune to help people get up to speed on how to respond to the question of, tell me about this conviction that's on your application. Having said that, I recognize that when you put the answer to the question on the application, there's a huge chance you won't even get through the door for the interview.
Right.
And I'm proud to say that we convinced our mayor here in New York, Mayor Bloomberg, to sign Executive Order 151 a year and a half ago, which he's implementing now, which has removed the question about the criminal record from all city applications.
Oh, that's great.
So now you could apply for any city job. You do not have to talk about your criminal record on the initial interview at all. And he did it as a way to deliberately get people through the door who have criminal records so that they can put their best foot forward and make the case. And it's modeled after a movement we've seen around the country, which was started by people who had done time in prison, called Ban the Box. And the idea is you ban the box from the initial application so that people don't have to deal with the same consternation that you're referring to, and can at least have a chance to make the best case.
But it's still legal for private employers to do that.
It is still legal for private employers, but I'm happy to say also that the mayor has taken it a step further and pulled in every social service agency that contracts with the city of New York.
Okay.
So now if you have a contract with the city of New York and you're a social service agency, which is a significant employer here in New York City at least, you also have to remove the question from your initial interview. Now,
as it relates to a background check, though, and you're applying for a specific job, it is still legal, to my knowledge, to deny someone employment based upon the results of a background check if that result comes back and says that you've been convicted of a crime directly related to that specific job that you're applying for. So, for example, if you were involved with, say, bank robbery, and you're applying at a bank, or you're applying for something where you would come into contact with money, the employer has a legal right to deny you employment based upon that.
Yeah, so yes and no. So yes, in that, yes, but there are mitigating factors, right? So if I'm a bank robber and I'm applying for a job as a cashier, but it's, say, 20 years later, then the employer has to take that into account. But let me answer the first part of your question first, which is, yes, employers have the right, as I mentioned earlier, when they think about liability, to take into account two things: the relationship between the conviction and the job the person's applying for, and whether the person poses unreasonable risk. But remember, even after the employer looks at those two prongs in the law, they have to look at the other 8 factors that I mentioned. So even though you might say, oh, direct correlation, robbery, working with money, I would argue that if time has passed, if they have evidence rehabilitation, if they have a certificate of relief from disability, that there are mitigating factors that mean that it's not so clear-cut.
Okay, I understand, because a lot of people get confused on that issue.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and I find that because I represented a client once, and he asked me how he should answer that question, I always tell him, be truthful, because if they find out later, you're going to be terminated. So if they find out up front and you're not given the chance to work at that organization, they're going to find out later and you're going to be terminated anyway.
I mean, unfortunately, I'd go a little further. Not only can you be terminated, unfortunately, you can actually be prosecuted.
Right.
Lying on an employment application is breaking the law. It's a misdemeanor. It's a legal document. And I've actually seen it happen in practice, unfortunately. After 9/11, the Attorney General in New Jersey prosecuted a bunch of folks who lied on their application to work in the airport. You know, talk about having a criminal record already and trying to dodge the stigma, and then suddenly you're facing a new conviction.
Right.
So I tell people, I say 2 things. One is what you said, which is, you know, you might get the job now, but when you go to apply for a promotion later, you know, you don't really have a leg to stand on, right? Because they may decide to do the background check at that point. That's number one. Number 2, if you have an interview and you tell the person at the interview and you don't put it on the application, technically you have no proof later on either. And then finally, all the protections I just talked about, Article 23A, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission guidance, and a couple other areas of protection, you lose all of that.
Sure.
Because as the employer, I'll just say, oh, it has nothing to do with his criminal record. It has to do with the fact that he lied on the application. And that's it. That's the end of the conversation.
Does Fortune Society counsel formerly incarcerated people on how to present themselves in an interview or how to approach these application questions?
So I think that's a big part of the value in our employment services workshop at Fortune. One thing I didn't say about Fortune earlier, and let me just squeeze it in now, is anyone who's been involved in the criminal justice system, whether it's a night in jail or 45 years in prison, can just walk through the door of Fortune. You don't need an appointment to get services. Anyone. We serve everyone who walks through the door. You don't need an appointment. You don't need clean time. We're a very different agency. In fact, we even prioritize people who fail in some of our programs.
What's clean time?
Drug use. So a lot of people involved in the criminal justice system have drug use, and many programs tell them, well, you got to show me that you've been clean for 30 days or 60 days. To me and to Fortune, that's just ridiculous, right? The idea is if people want to turn their lives around and move forward, you need to catch them at that point, not send them away and tell them come back in 30 days when you've been clean. So I wanted to put that out there. And then I think I forgot the original question.
Well, I want to ask you, are there any fees associated with anyone coming in the door to use any of the services that you provide over there?
Yeah, I'm happy to say as the head of fundraising for the agency, which has a $19 million budget, that we do all the fundraising. So there's no fees for anyone who walks through our door.
Great.
All of the services are free of charge, including the housing and mental health services, which are 2 of our most expensive programs. Some people come in and we take advantage of Medicaid if they have it as a way to bill for services. But to be quite frank, if someone comes in, they need treatment, and they don't have access to Medicaid, we serve them regardless, which is why our unrestricted funds are the most important. We don't have a huge amount of unrestricted funds, but donations from individuals are the most important piece of the pie for us, although the majority of our funds come from government funding.
Okay. And when we come back from our break, I want to ask you more about some of the advocacy issues that you're promoting right now. You know, some of the things that specifically as it relates to New York City, what do you find to be some of the main issues that we need to address here as a city and as a community to try to help formerly incarcerated individuals, and what you see as a trend happening throughout the country, and what do you think is going to be on the horizon for the future?
Good, I look forward to it.
Okay, so you're listening to WHCR. This is Tony Johnson at 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
WHCR 90.3 FM, New York.
With today's unpredictable economy, it's become quite strenuous for millions of jobless Americans to keep their heads above water. Yet as strenuous as it is for the average American, what about the formerly incarcerated American? Well, this is just how strenuous it can be. Recent national surveys indicate that the unemployment rate among the formerly incarcerated 1 year after release may be as high as 60%. However, fortunately, there's Fortune Society. For nearly half a century, the Fortune Society has proudly assisted formerly incarcerated men and women in the New York City area. The Fortune Society's initiatives include housing, education, employment, and substance abuse treatment, which have reinvigorated the lives of many. If you or a loved one have recently been released from prison and are actively seeking to fully reintegrate into society, visit fortunesociety.com for more information.
Did you know that when you apply for a job, your credit history may affect your chances of getting hired? And if you already have a job, your credit history can still be used against you. That's because a growing number of employers use credit reports to make hiring and firing decisions. This practice can have a discriminatory impact on people and communities of color and unfairly block many qualified people from employment. Help end this practice by speaking up. If you or someone you know has been turned down for a job or even fired from a job because of credit checks by an employer, please call NEDAP's Financial Justice Hotline at 212-925-4929.
If you or someone you know is receiving federal benefits from Social Security, Veterans Affairs, Railroad Retirement Board, Office of Personnel Management, or the Department of Labor, this message is for you. The Treasury Department is phasing out paper check payments and requiring federal benefit recipients to get their money electronically. You can choose to get your payments by direct deposit to a bank, credit union, or to a Direct Express debit MasterCard account. The deadline to switch is March 1st, 2013. If you do not choose a bank or credit union for your direct deposit, your funds will automatically go onto a Direct Express debit MasterCard. If you are already receiving your federal benefit payments by direct deposit, this change will not affect you. For more information, contact your local Social Security Administration office or call 1-800-333-1795. That's 1-800-333-1795.
Did you know that 20 to 25% of the homeless population in America suffers from some sort of mental illness? Mental illness is the third largest cause of homelessness among single adults in the U.S. Substance abuse is also both a cause and a result of homelessness in this country. Both illnesses are problems that plague people in the Harlem community. Organizations in Harlem like Western United provide the homeless who suffer from mental illness and substance abuse issues with housing, but their clients need continued treatment to heal. For more information on how you can help Western United help those who can't mentally or physically help themselves, visit westernunited.org. That's westernunited.org. Rebuilding lives and strengthening communities.
WHCR 90.3 FM, New York.
We're back, and you're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. And I'm your host, Tony Johnson, and this is Legalese. And today's guest is Glenn Martin, who is the Vice President of Development and Public Affairs and Director of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. And the Fortune Society is a social service and advocacy organization devoted to the successful reentry and reintegration of individuals with criminal histories. So, Glenn, before the break, I was throwing out some things that I'd like for us to talk about in the second half of the show. And one of the things I'd like to ask you is what's happening here at the city level throughout New York City and the Bloomberg administration, and how receptive or cooperative is this administration in working with the advocacy organizations surrounding these types of issues?
That's a really good question. So stop and frisk notwithstanding, I'll save that for another show.
Okay. December 12th, everyone.
One thing I think is worth talking about is the mayor's YMI initiative, or Young Men's Initiative. So the mayor has invested over $50 million of his own money and about $60 million of city funds into this effort to address the needs of young men 18 to 24. And one part of the population that he's definitely focused on very proactively are folks who've been involved in the criminal justice system. And the Fortune Society is a grantee through the YMI initiative. And what it allows us to do is to do some amazing internships to place young people into the labor market as a way to help them build the experience that it takes and the relationships that it takes to be able to navigate the labor market, even though they've been involved in the criminal justice system. We're helping young folks to get their GED. We're helping them to get into college and navigate the college process. But a big part of this is the mayor recognizing that even people who've been involved in the criminal justice system need support. And not only do they need support, that if you provide the right dosage, whether it be housing, education, employment, health care, and so on, that you have a really good chance of those folks being successful. And I've always been one to say that the people who end up in our criminal justice system, for the most part, are the products of our failed policies to begin with, whether it's our housing, economic development, healthcare policies, education policies. And so why wouldn't we provide these things as an intervention to get them to do the right thing, because most of them unfortunately missed it earlier on in life. And so I'm really proud of the administration for doing that. And you know, so there's a lot of really good things happening here on the city level. I don't want to be Pollyannish about it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, you mentioned earlier before the break about how Mayor Bloomberg had done some things in terms of employment, like removing the box from city applications. But what are some of the things that you've observed that are not working, that still need addressing here within the city?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that concerns me hugely. So you have the mayor taking a look at private college institutions that are predatory, that get people to go to school, take out these large loans, and unfortunately don't really help them to finish. Non-competitive colleges, right? They'll accept anyone as long as you take out the loans.
And then you're saddled with huge debt.
You're saddled with huge debt. So I appreciate him focusing on that, because it really does apply to people with criminal records, because they're a target of those universities, number one. But unfortunately, the problem is a lot worse for people with criminal records, because unfortunately you're starting to see institutions barring people from admissions based solely on having a criminal record. So imagine that, the idea that if you've been involved in the criminal justice system at any point in your life, that you cannot even apply to go to college in New York City and New York State in some places. And I am not only talking about private institutions, I'm talking about some of our public institutions.
Really?
And so SUNY has some universities that are particularly egregious, that are located right here in New York City, that ask applicants, for instance, to go get a copy of their rap sheet to be considered. And the problem with that is that when I get a copy of my own rap sheet, there's information on there that you may not have a right to see, like arrests that didn't lead to convictions.
Right.
And if you think about stop and frisk, it's not too hard to get arrested in New York City. So if I get arrested and the case is dismissed and sealed, why should I have to hand it over to a university?
But that seems counterintuitive to me, because it seems to me that even if you went to prison and you came out, you would want these individuals to get an education, to try to be productive members of society, quote unquote, and to, have a path to success.
You know, criminal justice policymaking, unfortunately, is not almost never based on rational reasoning, you know, to be honest, because the data says clearly that education reduces recidivism considerably. Higher education.
I was just thinking that.
I mean, I'm on the board of an organization called College and Community Fellowship right up here in Harlem, and they help women who are formerly incarcerated to get into college and navigate the college process. And their recidivism rate compared to the national recidivism rate is so low that it's like, why wouldn't we take this to scale? Why wouldn't we do more of this? The national recidivism rate hovers around 60%. The recidivism rate here in New York, the amount that people go back to prison within 3 years, is around 42%. So there you have a system that fails every single. No other industry would be allowed to continue to operate with that sort of failure rate, but prisons continue to operate. And then you have education that reduces. If you get a master's degree, your recidivism rate drops down to under 1%.
Really?
You know, and so we should be doing more of it.
Exactly. So that's why it seems odd and completely irrational to try to lock people out of an opportunity like education to decrease recidivism and to try to help these individuals on a path to maybe become a business owner.
Yep.
You know, we talked about entrepreneurialism about a week or two ago on the show, and provide other opportunities in business or technology or science or any other type of trade, if that's what you desire to do, to find a way to do that through education and training programs to get degrees, all that kind of thing.
You know, unfortunately, we're starting to see evidence of similar policies to SUNY's policies right here at CUNY. And so if there are students out there listening that are CUNY students, I'd push them to really have conversations with their administrators about the fact that if you have policies that make it overly stringent for people with criminal records to get into universities, that number one, it's racial discrimination. It translates into racial discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, it doesn't add itself to diversity on campus.
Sure.
And then finally, CUNY institutions, I mean, if you look at their mission, they should be doing more to bring in people who've been formerly incarcerated as a way to help build community.
Okay. And so you mentioned SUNY, which is at, the state universities. So what about on the state level?
Sure.
What are you seeing on the state level, and how has the state and this governor addressed some of these issues?
So I'll start with the positive. We've had more access to this governor's office probably than any other governor I can remember in recent history. The Secretary for Public Safety, Liz Glazier, meets with the reentry and alternative to incarceration programs here in New York monthly.
Okay.
And we have conversations about what the governor's office can be doing differently around people with criminal records. Two main initiatives that are going on. One is the Work for Success initiative. The Work for Success initiative is the governor's office taking a look at the programs that are offered in prison, trying to figure out what we're doing well and where we need to build capacity, and how do you link up the training in institutions with the real jobs on the ground, working closely with the regional economic development councils across the state of New York. And so I'm really hopeful about that. I mean, the conversation is starting right there in the criminal justice arena, but they're working with Department of Labor to figure out where the synergy is. And then on the housing side, we actually chair the housing committee, the Fortune Society, our president, Joanne Page. And what the governor's office is doing now is actually has an agreement with Fortune, a consulting agreement. So we're replicating our housing model upstate New York. For many years, the majority of people who went to prison came home to New York City. That flipped in 2009, and now the majority of people leaving prison in New York State actually go back to upstate New York. And
Really?
New York, so New York
Why is that? Do you know?
I would argue that if you put people in prison for way too long, by the time they come home, their family members are dead and gone or have moved away, number one. Number two, think about gentrification, right? So if you lived in West Harlem 20 years ago, you probably cannot afford to live in West Harlem today.
And one of the things that we talked about on last week's show, because I had a guest from the Center for Parole Restoration, and we talked about how sometimes when you come home and your family's still living in public housing, you're not allowed to come back there.
That's true. So we're actually working on that as an issue on the city level, and we're glad they're going to make some tweaks to their policy. I think there's a lot more they can do. But you're right. So, I always talk about what's called lifetime consequences. People sometimes call them collateral consequences. The idea that when you're convicted of a crime, it's not just the 6 or 7 years that you're sentenced to, but it's all of these barriers that are bestowed upon you by agencies outside of the courts. So at sentencing, we knock people down a few notches, right? We take away their right to vote, can't live in public housing, can't go to certain universities, all these different things. And unfortunately, there's no equal ceremony to bring people back up post-incarceration. And so we tell people, you come out of prison, you need to do the right thing, get a job, live, be stable, and so on. But then we have all these barriers, like the public housing barrier in place. Yeah, and then in the legislature in New York State, there's been a slowing down of reentry-related bills, unfortunately, over the last 3 years or so. I think 2009, people really spent a lot of their political capital to get the Rockefeller drug law reform to happen, which was the elimination of the majority of our mandatory minimum drug sentences here in New York, meaning it gives judges back the discretion to decide how much time a person should do.
Right.
But I think our legislators, even our well-intentioned legislators, our allies in the legislature, feel as though they've spent all of their political capital with the conservative Republicans and the people who had prisons in their district and haven't really been pushing the reentry bills the way they were pre-2009. I will say one thing, though. The advocates are getting a bit restless now at this point, having not passed many reentry bills over the last few legislative session, and are really thinking about galvanizing a new outside strategy to add political pressure.
Is the prison industrial complex still a major issue, in your opinion, in terms of building more prisons and less emphasis on rehabilitation? Because I've visited some clients in prison in this state particularly, and there's nothing there in these cities upstate other than the community of people who work at the prisons.
So you're right. So the most interesting thing a correction officer ever said to me was when I was leaving prison, a correction officer said to me, you being here helped me buy my boat, and when your son gets here, he's going to help my son buy his boat. And he said it so matter-of-factly, and most people would have been bothered by it, and maybe he was just trying to get me upset. But it reminded me that this is not just an issue of criminal justice, right and wrong. This is an issue of economics.
Right.
And you're right. There are communities upstate New York that would not exist were it not for the prison being there. So to me, it means that when we tackle these issues, we need to not just think ideologically about right and wrong and criminal justice, that we need to really be thinking about these people who have jobs, who will fight to the bitter end to keep those jobs. And in some ways, it helps me to sort of understand why people upstate are so bitter whenever we talk about prison closures. So again, I talked about all these great things happening. As an advocate, I love to highlight the success we've had. At the same time, we're losing the war, if you will, even if we're winning a few battles, because now you have private lobby pushing for the building of prisons, right? A lot of states and local jurisdictions have privatized their prisons, which means that you have private correction industries pushing to increase their stock value by building. Just last year, the largest private correction organization in the United States said to every governor in the United States, we will buy all of your prisons if you keep them 90% full for the next 25 years. I mean, is that about criminal justice, or is that about money?
There's no justice in that at all.
Absolutely. And so it's not just about prisons. It's about the hotel down the block. It's about the person who produces the clothing. It's about the person who brings the food to the facility. So we have this whole industry now that is a natural lobby pushing for the building of prisons. Look at the immigration debate. When people think of the immigration debate, they think it's all ideological. It's not. A lot of who's pushing that are the lobbyists for the private prisons, because if you create very harsh immigration policies and people end up being deported, they go from one prison to another across the United States for a year or two before they're deported, and someone's going to make money off of that.
Absolutely. Again, I want to encourage everyone to call in at 212-650-6903. We're talking with Glenn Martin from the Fortune Society. And Glenn, I wanted to ask you, how do you think New York compares to other states with respect to this issue as well? And then take it to the federal level on how the Obama administration deals with these issues on a national level.
Sure. So your listening audience may be a little bit surprised at this, but the truth is that people are looking toward New York because New York is actually leading the way in reducing recidivism, reducing the prison population, and reducing crime simultaneously. So what does that mean? It means that you don't need to incarcerate your way to public safety the way California tries to do. I mean, in California, you have judges telling them to reduce the prison population, and what do? They take people out of prison and put them into their jails.
Right.
To the point where the local jails are just like, you know what, we've had enough also. So it's going to come to a head again regardless. But in New
And,
York,
and now they just passed that law in California where the death penalty is still a viable option for convicted felons as well. So
they reduced their 3 strikes though. For people with nonviolent crimes, they got rid of the 3 strikes law. Unfortunately, before, if you stole a pizza as your 3rd crime, you'd be doing life in prison.
right.
So good things and bad things happening. If you go back to New York State, I just want to put what I just said in perspective, which is we still have 56,000 people in prison here in New York State, a very significant number. Before Rockefeller drug laws 39 years ago, we only had 12,000 people in prison. So we now have 56,000, down from about 78,000 in 1992. So we're reducing prison. A big part of it is that we invested in what's called alternatives to incarceration, like the programs run at the Fortune Society and the other alternative to incarceration agencies. And now I think we're reaping the benefits for that investment. So I know we only have a few minutes left. I want to talk about the Obama administration. Sure. I've had the luxury of working with Attorney General Eric Holder and a few other folks in the Obama administration, in the Department of Education and HUD on some of these issues. And I'm glad to say that, so the Obama administration reduced the crack cocaine sentencing disparities about a year and a half ago from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. I think that's a huge movement in the right direction. Sure. Although I would argue that when you find inequality in the criminal justice system, you should eliminate it, not reduce it. So we're going to push the Obama administration and Congress to take another swing at that until they get it right. But Attorney General Holder created the Interagency Reentry Council. So that shows the importance of this issue, that literally on the cabinet level, you have a reentry council made up of all the government agencies, HUD, EEOC, all Department of Health and so on, all taking a look at reentry and seeing what they can do. And, there was some movement in the first administration, but I would argue that, President Obama has to be really careful, right? He doesn't want to be seen as the black president who's only helping black people. And the more you do criminal justice issues, the more you can be painted in that way. But we're hoping that with this being, obviously his final administration, that there's more of an appetite for taking more risks and doing more to turn around the criminal justice system. And the fact that there was no Willie Horton-style debate during the presidential campaign that pretty much was about crime and suggesting that the president was soft on crime and so on, to me, gives them some space to do that. If you looked at the Republican criminal justice agenda and compared it to the Democrats' criminal justice agenda, there was actually a lot of synergy between the two of them. And I guess part of that is the Second Chance Act, which is a bill that's passed Congress year after year for the last few years and has funded reentry work all around the country. I think it needs to be funded a lot higher. I mean, the highest it's been is $100 million, but if you divide that by 700,000, that's not a lot of money per person. So I think the Obama administration needs to make it a priority to have the Second Chance Act funded at a much higher rate if they really care about reentry and reducing the amount of people in prison. I think they need to try to work harder to get rid of mandatory minimums. I think the Department of Education, even if you can't get Congress to reinstate Pell Grant eligibility, can create streams of funding that particularly target people in prison. And we are having those conversations with Undersecretary Cantor and other people in the Department of Education. So I'm cautiously optimistic. But at the same time, I'm hopeful that this final administration of the Obama administration will do more on criminal justice.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are hoping that a lot of the promises he's made and the fact that it's a second administration, a second term, will give him the opportunity to take on a lot of the issues that he didn't deal with the first time around. And I'd like to ask you, what do you see in the future for formerly incarcerated people who are trying to reenter society? Are you hopeful about the future in this area, or do you think that there's still going to be a lot of resistance and barriers going forward?
So as an advocate, I always think it's important for people to not look at me and think I'm just overly idealistic about these issues. Number one, I believe in tipping points, right? It took us a long time to get here, decades, centuries, if you want to talk about starting with slavery leading up to where we are now. I think it's Michelle Alexander that calls it the new Jim Crow. So I believe in tipping points. I think something is going to happen, but I think that tipping point is mostly going to be created from a couple of things. One, we cannot continue to afford to build prisons. Just that simple. $60 billion we're spending on prisons alone, not taking into account courts and jails and all these other things. That's number one.
But just the human capital involved with that.
I would like to think that people will be thinking in that direction. I think the other reason, so one for me is economics. Two is the explosion in technology. I think the advancement of technology means that people who were involved in the criminal justice system that are not people of color, that were able to come out and segue right back into the labor market and just go on with their lives can no longer do that. And like every other scourge that has plagued poor communities and black communities, it's not until people with the power to do something about it are suddenly impacted that we see change. So I think the advancement in technology with background checks and so on, and the fact that our system is so large that it's sweeping up all sorts of people these days, you combine those two things, and I think it's going to create just the right combustion to get some real meaningful change in this country on criminal justice issues.
And Glenn, how can people get in contact with you or with the Fortune Society when they want to find out more about how they can take advantage of some of the valuable services that they have to offer?
Sure. So in terms of getting in touch with the Fortune Society, you can visit our website at www.fortunesociety.org, www.fortunesociety.org. They can visit our Long Island City location, no appointment necessary, at 2976 Northern Boulevard in Queens, 2976 Northern Boulevard. They can give us a call at 212-691-7554, 212-691-7554. And then getting in touch with me is as easy as hitting me up on Twitter at Glenn E. Martin. That's GlenneMartin, at Glenn E. Martin on Twitter.
Glenn, I want to thank you for joining the show today because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think this is a really important issue because so many of us know people in this particular predicament, but so many are unsure about what path to take and how to get there. But thank God for people like you and the Fortune Society. So I want to thank you for the work that you're doing there and that the Fortune Society does on the whole to advocate for formerly incarcerated and try to change legislation and advocate for legislation to remove some of the barriers to having a successful reentry back into society.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you giving Fortune and myself the opportunity to be on the show today, Tony.
All right. Thanks a lot again, Glenn. And you're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. And I want to remind everyone that you can contact me on Facebook at Tony Johnson at Legalese, and on Twitter at TonyLegalese.com. If you have an email question, you can send it to me at legalese@whcr.org. And I want to wish everyone a very, very happy Thanksgiving tomorrow. And we will be back next week. And that topic will be wrongful convictions. I went to Benjamin Cardozo Law School here in the city, which initiated the Innocence Project. And so we're going to have a guest on and talk about some of those issues where people are still getting wrongfully convicted and the consequences and some of the strategies on how we can stop that kind of thing in our criminal justice system. So again, everyone have a very happy and safe Thanksgiving, and I look forward to seeing and talking to you next week.
WHCR 90.3 FM, New York.
Can you imagine waking up to a phone call telling you that your child was killed? How about seeing your little cousin lying in the street with a gunshot wound? Or reading in a daily paper that the star basketball player in your school was shot and killed? When young children and teenagers die without getting the chance to experience life, it not only affects parents, it affects us all. Violence in the city of New York has been on the rise for too long because our youth lack opportunities. Kids hanging on the street corners in Harlem need alternatives, like job trainings. So help become a solution. Join Street Corner Resources. Street Corner Resources is at the forefront in helping to eliminate gun and gang violence. They also provide education, employment training, and other resources to the community. For more information on how you can join or support Street Corner Resources, visit streetcornerresources.org. Don't allow children to fail. Allow them to choose.
Veterans have difficulty transitioning their military skills into civilian jobs. In New York City, an estimated 17,300 veterans are unemployed. Are you a veteran in desperate need of help? Do you want to take advantage of a life-changing opportunity? If so, the 369th Veterans Outreach Program is designed to assist veterans in Harlem and surrounding communities. Veteran services include resume preparation, interview workshops, access to interview attire, and reliable transportation. For more information, call the 369th Veterans Outreach Program at 646-533-9292.
Did you know that when you apply for a job, your credit history may affect your chances of getting hired? And if you already have a job, your credit history can still be used against you. That's because a growing number of employers use credit reports to make hiring and firing decisions. This practice can have a discriminatory impact on people and communities of color and unfairly block many qualified people from employment. Help end this practice by speaking up. If you or someone you know has been turned down for a job or even fired from a job because of credit checks by an employer, please call NEDAP's Financial Justice Hotline at 212-925-4929.
With today's unpredictable economy, it's become quite strenuous for millions of jobless Americans to keep their heads above water. Yet as strenuous as it is for the average American, what about the formerly incarcerated American? Well, this is just how strenuous it can be. Recent national surveys indicate that the unemployment rate among the formerly incarcerated 1 year after release may be as high as 60%. However, fortunately, there's Fortune Society. For nearly half a century, the Fortune Society has proudly assisted formerly incarcerated men and women in the New York City area. The Fortune Society's initiatives include housing, education, employment, and substance abuse treatment, which have reinvigorated the lives of many. If you or a loved one have recently been released from prison and are actively seeking to fully reintegrate into society, visit fortunesociety.com for more information.
From the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, this is Audio Files. I'm your host, Adam Warner. Today we're going where the boys are, or rather, places we typically associate with boys. We'll be heading to a Brooklyn gym where one female boxer has made it her mission to help at-risk teens.
She opens my mind, and it's in a funny way, and it's like after I'm done with her, my head hurts.
We'll visit an Italian social club that's endured a neighborhood's change.
Una giovane. Facile,